For a generation, this was the shape of a Friday night. You drove to a brightly lit store on the corner, walked past thousands of movies lined up on the shelves, argued a little about what to watch, and carried home a plastic case with a promise printed on the receipt. Bring it back on time or pay. Blockbuster is remembered as the company that missed the future. But the future was offered to it for $50 million, and it said no. At its peak, this company had more than 9,000 of these stores and more than 50 million members. It was the largest video rental business the world had ever seen, so dominant that its name was simply what people called the act of renting a movie at all. And the future did not sneak past it. The future walked into its headquarters, sat down across the table, and offered to sell itself. The leadership of the giant listened to the pitch from a small, struggling mail-order startup, and by most accounts, they nearly laughed it out of the room. That startup was Netflix, and the price they turned down would come to look like the greatest bargain and the greatest mistake in the history of home entertainment. But the rejected deal is only half of the story, and not even the more damning half. Because this was also a company whose profits secretly depended on something no business likes to admit out loud, making its own customers angry. To understand how a giant with 9,000 stores collapsed into nothing in barely a decade, you have to understand both the offer it refused and the quiet, corrosive way it had chosen to make its money in the first place. The business on the surface was simple and brilliant. Buy copies of movies, put them on shelves in convenient stores, and rent them out for a few days at a time. People wanted to watch films at home. They did not want to own every movie, and renting solved that perfectly. The company built stores everywhere in strip malls, on busy corners near grocery stores, until there was one within a short drive of almost everyone. Convenience was the entire product, and for years, no one offered more of it. But beneath that simple model was a second, less visible engine, and it is the key to everything that followed. The rentals themselves were not where the real money hid. A huge share of the profit came from a single, quietly resented source: the late fee. Keep a movie past its due date, even by a day, and you paid a penalty, sometimes more than the rental itself had cost. For millions of customers, that small stab of annoyance at the counter was a regular part of the experience. Consider what that meant as a business. In a single year around the turn of the millennium, late fees brought in roughly $800 million, somewhere near 16% of the company's entire revenue. Read that number carefully. Nearly 1 out of every $6 the company earned came not from delighting its customers, but from penalizing them. Its profitability was structurally tied to friction, to forgetfulness, to the small daily failures of the very people it depended on. That is a dangerous place for any business to stand, even if the money feels wonderful while it lasts. Because a fortune built on annoyance is a fortune with a target painted on it. Every angry customer at that counter was a tiny invitation to any competitor clever enough to remove the pain. The company had, without quite realizing it, made its own weakness enormous and obvious. It had taught tens of millions of people to associate its name with a small, recurring punishment. All it would take to topple it was someone willing to build the same convenience without the sting, and to make that person want it badly enough to try. And the strange thing is that, from inside the company, none of this looked like a problem. It looked like a feature. The late fee was so normal, so woven into the routine of renting a movie, that almost no one questioned it. Customers grumbled and paid. Executives watched the revenue climb and saw proof that the model worked. That is how the most dangerous vulnerabilities usually hide, not as obvious flaws, but as reliable sources of profit that everyone has simply stopped examining. The very predictability of the late fee income made it feel like strength, when it was in fact the single loose thread that a competitor would one day pull. For a long time, though, none of that mattered because the company was simply too big and too convenient to challenge. It reigned over the whole industry. Its stores were a fixture of daily life, as familiar as the supermarket. With more than 9,000 locations and more than 50 million members, it had a scale that no rival could dream of matching. Movie studios treated it as an essential partner. If you wanted to rent a film, this was, for practical purposes, the only game in town. That dominance created a powerful sense of safety, the kind that success always breeds and always disguises. The company had beaten or absorbed its competitors. It had a household name, a national footprint, and a reliable river of cash flowing in from both rentals and those lucrative late fees. From the inside, the business must have looked unassailable, a mature, profitable empire with no serious threat on the horizon. And that feeling of safety, more than any single decision, was the beginning of the end. because comfort makes it very hard to imagine your own destruction. When a company is winning this completely, every incentive pushes it to protect what already works. The stores were profitable. The late fees were profitable. The whole machine was humming. To seriously prepare for a different future would have meant questioning the very things making everyone rich right now, and almost no organization at the top of its game is willing to do that. The giant was not stupid. It was comfortable, and comfort at the wrong moment is just as fatal. There was another trap hidden in the sheer size of the empire. 9,000 stores is not just an asset, it is an anchor. Every one of those locations came with a lease, with shelves of physical inventory, with staff and lights and cash registers. That vast physical footprint had been the source of the company's dominance, but it also meant the company was bolted to a particular way of doing business. You cannot quietly pivot 9,000 stores. The very scale that made the giant untouchable in the old world made it slow, heavy, and expensive to change when the world shifted beneath it. Its greatest strength had quietly become the weight that would hold it under. Threat, when it arrived, did not look like a threat at all. It looked like a small, money-losing startup that mailed DVDs to people in red envelopes. Its founder had, according to the story he later told, come up with the idea after being charged a $40 late fee on a single rental, the exact kind of penalty that made the giant so much money. He had taken that moment of ordinary customer anger and built an entire company designed to erase it. No stores, no due dates in the old sense. No late fees, just movies delivered without the sting. In the year 2000, that struggling startup came to the giant with a proposal. It offered to sell itself entirely for $50 million. For a company earning billions, $50 million was a rounding error, a trivial sum to acquire a young business that had already identified and solved the giant's single greatest vulnerability. It was, in hindsight, one of the most generous gifts one company has ever offered another, the chance to simply buy the future cheaply and own both the present and whatever came next. The leadership declined. By the accounts that survive, the offer was not taken seriously. The little mail-order company was seen as a niche curiosity, unprofitable and small, hardly worth the attention of an empire. Why would the largest video rental business in the world pay anything for a fragile startup losing money on postage? The logic of the moment was almost reasonable, and that is exactly what makes it such a perfect and painful lesson. Because the most dangerous mistakes rarely feel like mistakes when you are making them. Look closely at what was really being refused. It was not just a company, it was an escape route. The giant had a business model quietly rotting from within, dependent on late fees, on friction, on customer resentment, and it was being handed for pocket change, the very thing that could carry it safely into the next era. To say yes would have meant admitting that its current way of making money had an expiration date. It could not bring itself to admit that. So it kept the late fees, kept the stores, kept the comfort, and let the future walk back out the door. The future did not sulk. It grew. The startup the giant had dismissed kept improving, kept adding members, and then made the leap that changed everything. It began delivering movies not by mail, but instantly over the internet. The friction the giant had monetized for decades, the drive to the store, the due date, the penalty, was being erased entirely, and customers who had quietly resented that friction for years left without much sorrow. The river of rental money and the river of late fee money both began to fall at once. Belatedly, the giant tried to respond. It launched its own online service. It introduced a program that let customers return movies by mail or in the store, and most tellingly, it moved to abolish the late fees that had been such a rich source of profit. In another timeline, these were the right moves. But they came years too late, and they were undermined from the inside. Franchisees and board members balked at killing the late fee income and at the cost of reinvention. The company that most needed to change course was the one least able to, precisely because it was still addicted to the profits it needed to give up. And so the collapse, when it came, was steep, weighed down by roughly $1 billion in debt and a customer base draining away to a better, frictionless alternative. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in September of 2010. The empire of 9,000 stores began to close, location by location, the bright signs going dark on corner after corner. By 2013, the brand had been sold off in bankruptcy, and the last company-owned stores were shut for good. A business that had defined an entire era of home entertainment was, within a few short years, essentially gone. The cruelest detail is the arithmetic of that refused offer. The company it declined to buy for $50 million would go on to become one of the most valuable entertainment businesses on the planet, worth many, many times what the entire giant had ever been. The $50 million was never really the price of a startup. It was the price of survival, offered at a discount so steep it looked like a joke. The giant laughed and kept its late fees, and in doing so wrote the first line of its own ending. What makes the fall so haunting is how quickly it happened and how ordinary it looked from the street. For years, the stores were still there, still busy on a Friday night, still renting movies as if nothing had changed. The decline did not announce itself with a single dramatic collapse. It came as a slow leak, a few less customers each month, a few more empty shelves, a store closing here and another there. And then, seemingly all at once, the leak became a flood, and the corner that had held one of those bright storefronts for as long as anyone could remember simply went dark, its shelves emptied, its sign taken down. An empire that had felt permanent turned out to be astonishingly fragile the moment a better idea arrived. It is tempting to reduce this to a single famous blunder, the company that could have bought its rival and didn't. But that version is too small, and it lets the deeper lesson escape. The refusal of the offer was not the disease. It was a symptom. The real sickness was the business model underneath. A fortune that depended on frustrating its own customers, on penalties and friction and the small daily annoyances of the people it served. A company built that way is not just vulnerable to disruption. It is actively recruiting it. This is the quieter truth worth carrying away. When your profits depend on friction, on fees, on penalties, on making something harder than it needs to be, you are leaving a standing invitation for anyone willing to remove that friction. Every late fee was a reason for a customer to root for an alternative. Every drive to the store, every missed due date, every awkward moment at the counter was a small crack in the foundation. The giant did not just fail to adapt. It had spent years training its own customers to want it gone. And layered on top of that was the second, more human failure, the arrogance that comfort breeds. When the escape route appeared, cheap and obvious, the company could not see it, because seeing it clearly would have meant admitting that its comfortable, profitable present was already dying. That is the trap that catches so many dominant companies. The very success that makes them rich makes them unable to imagine losing, and so they guard the thing that is killing them and dismiss the thing that could save them, right up until the moment it is far too late. You can see the same pattern everywhere once you know to look for it. Any business whose profits lean on friction, on hidden fees, on penalties, on making it deliberately hard to cancel or to leave, is running the same quiet risk the giant did. That friction feels like reliable money right up until someone builds the same thing without it, and then it turns out the customers were never loyal at all. They were merely trapped and waiting. The lesson is not really about video stores. It is about the difference between a customer who stays because they want to and a customer who stays because they have no choice, and how dangerous it is to mistake the second kind for the first. The stores were everywhere. The name was on every corner. The customers, for a while, had nowhere else to go. But a business that profits from the frustration of the people it serves has built its house on sand, no matter how tall the house. When something better and kinder finally arrives, the customers do not mourn. They simply leave. The giant was not brought down by a competitor's genius alone. It was brought down by a bill that had been quietly coming due for years, the price of every penalty it ever charged, and every chance to change that it was too comfortable to take. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It describes a corporate bankruptcy and a series of lawful business decisions, and makes no allegation of criminal wrongdoing by any individual or company. All figures are drawn from publicly available reporting from credentialed sources, and source links are provided above.